For most of the season, Kate Martin's world looked the same every single night. Same arena lights. Same warm-ups. Same seat at the end of the Las Vegas bench. Game after game, she watched. She watched the starters run the offense. She watched the veterans close out tight games. She watched the clock tick down while her name never got called. And the strange thing is, nobody outside the team really noticed. Because from the outside, everything looked perfect. She had made the WNBA. She was on one of the most powerful teams in the league. A championship roster filled with all-stars and Olympians. For most rookies, just being there would feel like winning the lottery. But inside that arena, night after night, something else was happening. Something quieter. Something heavier. Confidence doesn't disappear all at once. It fades slowly. First it's a few fewer minutes in the rotation. Then it's sitting during the fourth quarter. Then entire games pass where you never step on the floor. And before long, a thought starts creeping in that every athlete fears. Maybe they don't believe in me. Kate Martin never said those words publicly. She's not the kind of player who complains. Anyone who watched her at Iowa knows that. She built her reputation doing the things nobody celebrates. Setting screens, diving for loose balls, making the extra pass. But even the toughest competitors feel doubt when the silence gets too loud. And during that first WNBA season in Las Vegas, the silence was everywhere. Practices where she ran the scout team. Timeouts where she stood quietly at the edge of the huddle. Playoff games where she watched from the bench as the clock ran down. 6 postseason games. 3 total minutes. Not 3 minutes per game. 3 minutes total. For a player who had just come off one of the most electric college basketball runs in recent memory, it felt surreal. Just months earlier, she had been playing in packed arenas, helping lead Iowa to back-to-back Final Four appearances alongside Caitlin Clark. Now she was barely touching the floor. And when that kind of shift happens that quickly, the mind starts asking dangerous questions. Was college just different? Was Iowa the perfect system? Was the WNBA exposing something nobody else saw? Those questions don't arrive all at once. They sneak in quietly, usually late at night, when the arena lights are off and the noise of the game fades away. And eventually, Kate Martin did something she had done many times before when she needed perspective. She picked up the phone. On the other end was someone who knew her game better than almost anyone alive. Caitlin Clark. Most people know Clark as the superstar. The logo threes, the sold-out arenas, the records that kept falling week after week. But the version of Caitlin Clark that Kate Martin knew was different. That version had spent years in the gym with her. Years building trust. Years watching her do the work that never showed up on highlight reels. So when Kate finally explained what was happening in Las Vegas, Clark didn't give her the polite answer. She gave her the honest one. 6 words that completely changed how Kate Martin saw her own career. 6 words that would eventually push her toward a decision nobody saw coming. But to understand why that moment mattered so much, you have to understand who Kate Martin really was long before the WNBA ever called her name. If someone wanted to understand what made Kate Martin so valuable, they wouldn't need to watch an entire season of games. One night in particular tells the story almost perfectly. The 2023 Final Four matchup between Iowa and South Carolina wasn't supposed to be competitive. At least, that's what most analysts believed going into it. South Carolina had entered the tournament undefeated, dominating opponents with a roster that looked almost unfair on paper. Their frontcourt was massive, physical, and experienced, a combination that had bullied teams all season long. Many people had already penciled them into the national championship game before the ball was even tipped. Iowa, meanwhile, had one obvious advantage: Caitlin Clark. But even Clark's brilliance didn't convince many experts that Iowa could actually pull off the upset. The conversation leading up to the game was mostly about how explosive Clark would have to be just to keep the score respectable. But inside Iowa's locker room, the mindset was different. Kate Martin had spent days studying South Carolina's tendencies. She knew their rebounding angles, their defensive rotations, and the way their bigs tried to seal defenders under the rim. It wasn't glamorous work, but Martin had always believed that preparation created confidence. And confidence is often what separates teams in moments like these. From the opening minutes of the game, something unusual started happening. South Carolina's offense looked slightly out of rhythm. Passing lanes that normally opened weren't there. Rebounding positions were contested earlier than expected. Their guards found themselves facing defenders who seemed to know exactly where the next pass was going. Martin was at the center of much of it. She was constantly talking on defense, directing teammates before the play even unfolded. When South Carolina tried to push the pace, she slowed them down with perfectly timed rotations. When a shot went up, she fought for space under the rim like someone who understood that every extra possession mattered. Meanwhile, Clark was doing what the entire basketball world had come to expect from her. Creating shots that felt almost impossible, stretching defenses far beyond their comfort zones. The combination became overwhelming for South Carolina. Every time they focused too heavily on stopping Clark, someone else on Iowa found an opening. Martin made sure those openings didn't go to waste. She cut through gaps in the defense, grabbed defensive rebounds that extended possessions, and delivered smart passes that kept the offense flowing. None of it looked flashy. None of it was designed to go viral online. But every one of those plays slowly tilted the balance of the game. As the minutes ticked down, the energy in the arena shifted from disbelief to something much louder. Iowa wasn't just hanging around. They were winning. South Carolina, a team that had walked into the Final Four without a single loss, suddenly looked stunned. Their usual dominance around the basket wasn't working the same way. Their rhythm had been disrupted piece by piece. And when the final buzzer sounded, the result shocked nearly everyone watching. Iowa had done it. They had taken down the undefeated powerhouse that most people believed was untouchable. Naturally, the headlines the next day focused heavily on Clark's incredible performance. That was expected. She had delivered another unforgettable night under the brightest lights. But inside the basketball world, players and coaches noticed something else. They noticed the screens that freed shooters. The defensive communication that kept Iowa organized. The rebounds that prevented South Carolina from controlling the paint. They noticed Kate Martin. For Martin herself, that game would later stand out as one of the most meaningful moments of her entire career. Not because it brought her personal fame, but because it proved something she had always believed about basketball. Winning isn't only about the star. It's about the system working together. For 2 straight seasons, Iowa rode that chemistry all the way to the Final Four, becoming one of the most talked about teams in college basketball. Arenas filled with fans. Television ratings climbed higher than anyone expected. The team felt unstoppable, powered by a combination of superstar brilliance and unselfish teamwork. From the outside, it looked like the perfect basketball story. But professional sports have a way of rewriting stories very quickly. Because when Kate Martin entered the WNBA, the environment she stepped into was nothing like the one that had helped her thrive at Iowa. Long before the WNBA, before the packed arenas and national headlines, Kate Martin had already figured out something about basketball that most players spend their entire careers trying to understand. Not every great player becomes the star of the show. Some players become something even more valuable, the person who makes the entire system work. At the University of Iowa, the spotlight belonged to Caitlin Clark. From the moment Clark stepped on the court, it was obvious the world was watching something special. Her shooting range stretched halfway across the floor, her passing felt almost instinctive, and every game seemed to bring another record falling. Cameras followed her everywhere. Fans lined up hours before tip-off just to see her warm up. And Kate Martin? She was right there beside her the entire time. But if you only watched the highlights, you might never fully understand what Martin actually meant to that team. Because her impact didn't always show up in the places fans usually look. She wasn't chasing scoring titles or viral moments. Instead, she was doing the kind of work that makes great teams function. The work that rarely gets posted online but is impossible for teammates to ignore. Martin understood spacing, timing, and positioning in a way that coaches dream about. She set screens that freed Clark for open shots. She fought for rebounds that kept possessions alive. She rotated defensively before the opposing offense even realized the opening had closed. Those small details might not grab headlines, but they are the invisible foundation of winning basketball. What made Martin different, though, wasn't just her awareness on the court. It was her maturity. College locker rooms can sometimes be fragile places, especially when one player receives most of the attention. But Martin never treated Clark's success as something that took away from her own role. In fact, she seemed to understand that Clark's brilliance made the entire team more dangerous, and she leaned into that reality instead of fighting it. That attitude quietly reshaped Iowa's culture. When one of your hardest-working players is also the one setting the tone for everyone else, the rest of the team begins to follow that energy. Practices became sharper. Communication improved. Players trusted each other more because they knew someone was always willing to do the unglamorous work. Clark noticed it almost immediately. Early in their time together, she had heard stories about Martin's high school scoring numbers and assumed she might arrive at Iowa expecting to dominate the ball. Instead, she found a teammate who cared more about making the right play than proving she was the best player on the floor. That kind of mindset builds trust faster than almost anything in sports. And trust was exactly what started to grow between them. Their chemistry didn't come from a single big game or a dramatic moment under bright lights. It developed slowly, through hundreds of small interactions, early morning workouts, film sessions, late practices when most of campus had already gone quiet. Martin studied the game obsessively, learning how Clark liked to attack defenses and where the openings would appear before the play even unfolded. Before long, something almost strange began happening during games. Clark would launch a deep three, and Martin would already be moving toward the exact spot where the rebound might land. Clark would drive into traffic, and somehow Martin would appear in the perfect passing lane without either of them needing to call it out. To outsiders, it looked like simple teamwork. But teammates knew it was something deeper, the kind of connection that only forms when two players completely trust how the other sees the game. Off the court, Martin invested just as much effort into building relationships with the rest of the roster. She believed strongly in what she once called relationship equity. In simple terms, it meant earning the right to hold teammates accountable because you had already invested time caring about them as people first. Team dinners, long conversations after practice, checking in with younger players. Martin did those things naturally. And because of that, when the team faced difficult moments during games, her voice carried weight inside the huddle. That leadership became especially important as Iowa's popularity exploded. What had once been a typical college arena environment suddenly turned into something closer to a traveling spectacle. Carver Hawkeye Arena began selling out regularly. Fans from across the country showed up just to watch Clark play. Television cameras captured nearly every moment. But inside that storm of attention, the team never lost its balance. And a big reason for that stability was standing just a few feet away from the spotlight. Kate Martin never needed the attention to validate her role. She already knew exactly what she brought to the floor. Her job wasn't to be the headline. Her job was to make sure the story kept moving. And there was one game, one night that shocked the entire country, where that quiet influence became impossible to ignore. The jump from college basketball to the WNBA is something even the most talented players struggle to describe. You can prepare for it physically. You can train harder, watch more film, and spend entire summers working on your game. But nothing truly explains what the professional level feels like until you step on the floor and experience it for yourself. For Kate Martin, that moment arrived when the Las Vegas Aces selected her in the draft. On paper, it sounded like an incredible opportunity. The Aces weren't just another WNBA team, they were a championship powerhouse. Their roster was stacked with veterans who had spent years dominating the league. MVP-level talent, Olympic gold medalists, players who had already proven themselves at the highest level of professional basketball. For a rookie, that kind of environment can feel both exciting and intimidating at the same time. During the early weeks of the season, Martin did what she had always done. She worked. She studied the playbook, asked questions during practice, and tried to absorb as much knowledge as possible from the veterans around her. In many ways, it reminded her of her early days at Iowa, learning a system, earning trust, and slowly finding a role within the team. At first, it seemed like that process might actually work. In the opening stretch of the season, Martin was seeing around 20 minutes per game. For a rookie on a championship contender, that was more than respectable. She wasn't asked to carry the offense or take over games, but she was contributing in the same ways she always had, defending, rebounding, making smart decisions with the ball. But as the season moved forward, something started to change. The rotation began to tighten. Veterans who had been with the team longer naturally took priority as the Aces pushed toward another championship run. Coaches leaned more heavily on players they trusted in high-pressure situations. That's not unusual in professional sports. Contending teams often shorten their rotations as the stakes rise. For Martin, though, the shift was dramatic. Those 20 minutes slowly became 15. Then 12. Then sometimes barely more than 10. Her stat line began shrinking along with the playing time. Points dropped. Rebounds dropped. Opportunities to impact games became fewer and fewer. From the outside, someone glancing at the numbers might assume her performance had declined. But the reality was much simpler. She just wasn't getting the same chances. By the time the playoffs arrived, the situation had reached a point that few rookies are emotionally prepared for. Game after game passed where Martin barely left the bench. The Aces were chasing another title, and when teams are fighting for championships, development often becomes a secondary priority. Across 6 playoff games, Kate Martin stepped onto the court for only 3 total minutes. Not because she was injured. Not because she had suddenly forgotten how to play basketball. Simply because the team had already decided who they trusted in those moments. For a player who had spent years contributing to one of the most successful college programs in the country, it was a difficult adjustment. The WNBA is brutally competitive. With limited roster spots and some of the best athletes in the world fighting for playing time, opportunities can disappear quickly. Martin handled it professionally, just as she had handled every challenge before. She never criticized coaches publicly. She never complained about the situation. Instead, she continued showing up to practices, doing the small things, and supporting her teammates. But that doesn't mean the experience was easy. There is a particular kind of frustration that comes from feeling invisible in a place you worked so hard to reach. It's not loud or dramatic. It doesn't happen all at once. Instead, it builds slowly over time. A few more games on the bench. Another practice running plays for the opposing team. Another night where your name never gets called. Eventually, even the most confident players begin asking themselves difficult questions. Was college success just a perfect storm? Was the professional level revealing something she hadn't seen before? Those thoughts are dangerous for any athlete, because once doubt enters the conversation, it can grow quickly. And for Kate Martin, the uncertainty only deepened as the season moved toward its end. The league was preparing for something new. An expansion team entering the WNBA for the first time in years. With that expansion draft came a difficult reality. Not every team would protect every player on its roster. Some players would be left exposed. And nobody in Las Vegas had given Martin any clear answers about where she stood. She was stuck in a strange kind of limbo, unsure whether the team saw her as part of their future or simply as a temporary roster spot. That uncertainty can wear on a person. And eventually, it led to the moment that would quietly change everything. One phone call. By the time the season was winding down, Kate Martin had reached a place that many professional athletes quietly experience but rarely talk about. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even frustration in the way people might imagine. It was something more subtle, a creeping uncertainty that slowly works its way into the back of your mind when things stop making sense. She was still practicing hard. Still doing everything coaches asked of her. Still preparing for games as if she might be called at any moment. But deep down, the situation in Las Vegas had started to feel like quicksand. The harder she worked, the more it felt like she was standing in the exact same spot. And the most difficult part was the silence. No one had clearly told her where she stood with the organization. No one had said whether she was part of their long-term plans. The expansion draft was approaching, and with it came a question that hovered over several players on the roster. Would the Aces protect her, or leave her exposed? Without answers, the mind tends to fill the gaps on its own. Late at night, after games and practices were over, Martin found herself replaying the same thoughts again and again. Maybe the coaches saw something in practice she didn't notice. Maybe her role at Iowa had only worked because of the specific system around her. Maybe the professional game was simply a different level she hadn't fully adjusted to yet. Athletes rarely admit those thoughts out loud. But they're real. Eventually, Martin reached out to someone who had seen every version of her game. The confident one, the exhausted one, the one still shooting jumpers long after practice ended. She called Caitlin Clark. At the time, Clark was dealing with her own whirlwind in the WNBA. As one of the most anticipated rookies in league history, she had stepped into a storm of media attention, physical defenses, and expectations that few players ever face all at once. Every game she played felt like a national event. Every performance was dissected and debated across sports media. In other words, Clark had more than enough on her plate. But when Martin called, she answered. Their conversation started the way many conversations between old teammates do, catching up, talking about how the season had unfolded, comparing experiences in the pros. But eventually Martin explained what had really been weighing on her. The shrinking minutes. The uncertainty around the expansion draft. The feeling that her career had somehow stalled before it ever truly began. Clark listened. And then she said something that Martin hadn't heard from anyone else since arriving in Las Vegas. She told the truth. Clark reminded her of the years they had spent building Iowa's success together. The hours in the gym. The defensive adjustments Martin used to call out during games. The way she understood basketball beyond just scoring points. Then she said the words that shifted Martin's entire perspective. You're not failing, they're failing you. It wasn't said as an insult toward anyone in Las Vegas. Clark wasn't attacking the organization or questioning the talent around Martin. What she meant was something simpler and more powerful. The environment around a player matters. Some systems highlight your strengths. Others bury them. Clark had seen Martin thrive in a system that valued intelligence, communication, and unselfish play. She knew the type of player Martin was, the kind who raises the level of everyone around her. And she refused to let one difficult situation convince her friend that those qualities had suddenly disappeared. For Martin, hearing that perspective from someone who knew her so well had an immediate impact. When you spend too long inside a problem, it becomes easy to believe the problem is you. Clark's words forced her to step back and look at the situation differently. Maybe the issue wasn't her ability. Maybe it was simply the wrong fit. Not long after that conversation, the uncertainty surrounding the expansion draft finally turned into clarity. The Las Vegas Aces made their protection decisions, and Martin's name wasn't on the list. That meant she was eligible to be selected by the league's newest franchise, the Golden State Valkyries. For some players, learning they weren't protected might have felt like rejection. But because of that conversation with Clark, Martin saw it through a completely different lens. It wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a second chance. When the Golden State Valkyries began building their roster, they weren't looking for ready-made superstars. Expansion teams rarely get that luxury. Instead, they were searching for something more foundational. Players who understood teamwork, players who could build a culture from the ground up. In many ways, that description fit Kate Martin almost perfectly. Unlike established franchises that already have a strict hierarchy, expansion teams start with a blank canvas. Every practice helps define the identity of the organization. Every player helps set the tone for what the locker room will become. For athletes who thrive on communication, effort, and leadership, that kind of environment can feel like an opportunity rather than a risk. That's exactly how Martin approached it. The moment she arrived, the atmosphere felt different from what she had experienced the previous season. Instead of stepping into a roster where roles had already been cemented for years, she found herself surrounded by players who were all trying to prove something. Some had bounced between teams looking for stability. Others had played overseas or waited years for a real opportunity in the WNBA. Everyone understood that they were building something new together. The Valkyries' leadership made it clear from the start that their vision wasn't centered around chasing individual stats or highlight plays. They wanted smart basketball, high effort, unselfish decision-making. Players who valued the collective success of the team more than personal recognition. For Martin, that philosophy felt familiar. It reminded her of the culture she had experienced at Iowa, a system where understanding the game and trusting teammates mattered more than who scored the most points. In practices, she quickly found herself doing the same thing she had always done best. Communicating on defense, helping organize the offense and making sure teammates were in the right positions. Coaches noticed it immediately. Players noticed it too. Basketball teams often develop a natural rhythm when the right personalities come together, and Martin's presence helped accelerate that process. Her ability to read the game allowed others to play more freely, knowing someone on the floor was always thinking one step ahead. But the difference between this environment and the one she had left behind was simple. Here, those qualities were valued. Instead of wondering when she might get a chance to contribute, Martin was being encouraged to embrace her role fully. She didn't need to change her identity as a player. The team wanted exactly what she already brought to the court. The fan base in the Bay Area added another layer of excitement to the experience. When the Valkyries announced their arrival, the response from the community was immediate. Season tickets sold out quickly, and the energy inside the arena reflected the curiosity surrounding a brand new franchise. For the players, that support mattered. Expansion teams often face difficult early seasons while they figure out their chemistry, but the fans stayed engaged from the very beginning. Every defensive stop, every hustle play, every small victory felt like part of a larger story being written in real time. Martin noticed that atmosphere right away. During one early home game, even as the team struggled to close the gap on the scoreboard, the crowd never lost its energy. People stayed in their seats until the final buzzer, cheering as if the team had already established years of history. Moments like that reminded her why she loved the game in the first place. Basketball had never been about individual fame for her. It was about connection, between teammates, between players and fans, between effort and belief. The Valkyries were still figuring out their identity, but the foundation felt promising. And somewhere in the middle of all that excitement, Martin found herself doing something she hadn't felt comfortable doing for months. She started playing freely again, not worrying about whether a mistake might send her back to the bench, not overthinking every decision on the court, just reacting, communicating, and trusting the instincts that had carried her through college basketball's biggest stages. Sometimes the biggest change in a career doesn't come from improving your skills. Sometimes it comes from finally landing in the place where those skills are understood. And as the Valkyries continued shaping their roster and culture, one thing became increasingly clear. Kate Martin hadn't lost the qualities that made her special. She had simply found the system that allowed them to matter again. Something interesting happens when a player finally lands in the right environment. The game starts to slow down again. Decisions become clearer. Confidence, which once felt shaky, begins to return almost without the player realizing it. For Kate Martin, that shift didn't happen overnight, but it was noticeable. Practices with the Valkyries felt different from the moment they began building chemistry. Instead of trying to squeeze into a system that already had its stars and established roles, the team was experimenting, learning, and shaping its identity together. That kind of environment rewards players who understand the deeper details of basketball: communication, positioning, anticipation. Martin had spent her entire career developing those exact skills. During scrimmages and early games, teammates quickly learned that if Martin was on the floor, the defense became more organized. She was constantly pointing, calling out switches, reminding teammates where the next action might come from. It wasn't loud or dramatic leadership, but it was the kind that helps teams settle down when things start moving too fast. Offensively, the same patterns began appearing. Martin wasn't forcing shots or chasing scoring numbers. Instead, she was making the smart extra pass, spacing the floor correctly, and cutting at the exact moment defenders lost focus. The plays didn't always end with her scoring, but they often ended with someone on the team getting a better look at the basket. Coaches love that kind of basketball, because over time, those small decisions add up. Teams that move the ball well become harder to defend. Teams that communicate constantly make fewer mistakes. And teams built on unselfish habits tend to grow stronger as the season progresses. For Martin personally, the biggest change was internal. Back in Las Vegas, every missed opportunity had started to feel like proof that something was wrong. Here, mistakes were simply part of the process of building something new. If a play broke down, coaches talked about how to fix it. If a shot didn't fall, teammates encouraged the next attempt. The pressure to prove she belonged began fading away. Instead of worrying about surviving in the league, Martin could focus on contributing again, the same way she had at Iowa. Defense, hustle, basketball IQ. The things that rarely go viral but quietly decide whether teams win or lose. Stories like this are part of what makes sports fascinating. Sometimes the difference between struggling and thriving isn't talent at all. It's context. The right coach, the right teammates, the right system that understands what a player naturally brings to the floor. If you enjoy hearing the deeper stories behind athletes, the moments that never show up in highlight reels but shape entire careers, make sure you're subscribed. These journeys are often far more interesting than the box scores, and there are plenty more stories like this still to come. Because Kate Martin's story isn't really about one phone call or one team change. It's about something much bigger. It's about realizing that the place where you start isn't always the place where you're meant to grow. And once Martin stepped into an environment that valued the things she had always done best, the version of her game that Iowa fans remembered started showing up again. Not louder, just stronger. Which brings us to the real lesson hidden inside this entire journey. A lesson that applies far beyond basketball. Looking back at the entire journey, it's easy to focus on the dramatic moments. The Final Four run at Iowa. The bright lights of the WNBA draft. The quiet frustration of sitting on the bench in Las Vegas. The phone call that shifted everything. Each of those moments feels like a turning point when you hear the story from the outside. But the truth is, Kate Martin's career was never defined by just one moment. It was defined by the same qualities she had always carried with her. Patience, awareness, and a deep understanding of what winning basketball actually looks like. Those qualities didn't suddenly disappear when her minutes dropped in Las Vegas. They didn't vanish when the stat sheet stopped reflecting her impact. They were still there the entire time, waiting for the right situation to bring them back into the spotlight. Professional sports have a way of testing players in ways fans rarely see. When things are going well, confidence feels automatic. But when opportunities shrink and doubts start creeping in, the real challenge becomes mental. You have to believe in your own value even when the environment around you stops showing it. For a while, that challenge followed Martin through her first WNBA season. Sitting on the bench during those playoff games forced her to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes talent alone isn't enough. Timing matters. Opportunity matters. And perhaps most importantly, the system around you matters more than people realize. That's why the conversation with Caitlin Clark carried so much weight. Clark wasn't simply offering encouragement. She was reminding her friend of something athletes often forget when they're trapped inside a difficult situation. Your environment doesn't define your ability. Sometimes it only defines how visible that ability becomes. When the Golden State Valkyries selected Martin, it wasn't some dramatic rescue story. No one swooped in to save her career. What happened instead was far simpler, and in many ways more powerful. She stepped into a place where the things she had always done well were finally recognized again. A team that valued communication. A coaching staff that appreciated basketball IQ. Teammates who understood that winning requires more than just scoring points. In that kind of system, Martin didn't need to reinvent herself. She simply needed to be the same player she had always been. And that realization reveals the deeper lesson behind her journey. Sometimes success isn't about becoming someone different. Sometimes it's about finding the place where the version of you that already exists is allowed to thrive. For athletes, that might mean changing teams or systems. For others, it might mean changing jobs, environments, or even the people they surround themselves with. The principle stays the same. The wrong environment can make even the most capable person question themselves. The right one can bring everything back into focus. Kate Martin's story isn't finished yet. The Valkyries are still building their identity, and expansion teams rarely follow predictable paths. There will be new challenges ahead, new adjustments, and new moments where the future feels uncertain. But one thing is already clear. The player who once helped anchor Iowa's historic run never disappeared. She was simply waiting for the right place to show it again.